I am Professor Thomas White, and welcome to my presentation on what I regard as the most overlooked and dangerous business ethics issue. Thanks very much for being here, and I hope that you consider this to be worth your time and energy. For those of you who do not know my work, let me give you a brief introduction. I am the founder and executive director of the International Business Ethics Case Competition. I have a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. I've actually had two careers as an academic. I taught at Uppsala College in New Jersey for about 15 years. Then I've taught business ethics for about 25 to 30 years, first at the business school at Rider University in New Jersey and Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. At LMU, it's where I founded IBEC, and I held the Hilton Chair in Business Ethics and was director of the Center for Ethics in Business. One of the tasks I had at that point was to work as sort of a contact person for the ethics and compliance community in the area, the group called the Southern California Business Ethics Roundtable. And I've been pleased that one of the hallmarks of my career is to have good relationships with folk in business. So you should be getting a feel for the fact that the kind of work I do is what we call applied ethics. It's practical as opposed to theoretical. Theory is fun. I've done some of that. But the main thrust of my work is really, particularly from the standpoint of working in a business school, identifying problems and looking for solutions to them. So my orientation is very much, as I said, pragmatic, not ideological. I look for solutions, not necessarily when they aren't apparent, really keep looking for them, but it's not a matter of assigning blame. It's trying to find causes and effects and then figuring out how to do things better. What I consider probably the most sort of consequential work I've done has been in the area of animal ethics. My book, In Defense of Dolphins, is an example of that. I have sort of specialized in the ethical implications of the scientific research on dolphins. I've very much been a pioneer in this regard because, as far as I know, I was the first philosopher working in this area that spent a significant amount of time with observing marine mammal scientists do their research in the wild. Even now, I think there's only one other philosopher who does sort of equivalent sort of work. That's Kristen Andrews, who works on primates. But it's been very important for me because it has taught me the importance of primary data. Actually, that's something I learned in connection with historical scholarship, the importance of primary sources as opposed to secondary sources. With scientific data, you've got to get in the field. It cannot be an armchair enterprise. And it's very important in any ethical issue, always to get down to as much as you can to raw data. This talk is, I want to make clear, to be seen in that context. The work that I do as a philosopher, while I am the founder and executive director of IBEC, this is my personal perspective on this. This should not be taken as representing the position of the organization or anyone else connected with it. So that this is very much my point of view on this. The point of this presentation, actually a series of presentations. This will be the first. There's at least going to be one more. If there's sufficient interest, we'll keep it going, because the point is to generate discussion of what I see as a significant problem, and discussion to try to find solutions about how we make things better. Now, apropos of the fact that I just said about the importance of data, on the Socrates Comes to Wall Street website, which is where I'm hosting this, which is where you'll find an opportunity to engage in discussion. There will also be the sources that I identify, the sources I've used in this talk, so that you can use that as a jumping off point to look into the issue more deeply. Finally, I am launching this presentation on Giving Tuesday. The point of this is hopefully to encourage people to donate to the International Business Ethics Case Competition. There is a competition coming up this April. We would love to have your support. Our mission is to develop the next generation of ethical business leaders, and anything you can do will be greatly appreciated. So let's get down to business. Okay, let me pull up my slides. That, and we need this, and we need this, and we're good. So, as I said, this is a talk on what I consider to be the most overlooked and dangerous business ethics issue, which is the monetization of falsehoods, ignorance, fear, and conflict in the so-called information industry. That's a long-winded way of saying making money off of lying or scaring people. Now, there are other issues, other ethical dangers out there. AI is getting a lot of attention. But the reason that I am focusing on this is because the problem of monetizing fear, monetizing anxiety in that industry is immediate. The size and scope of the danger are apparent and clear from the present. We don't have to speculate about the future. We can see it now. We can see the impact daily, and I think that is a strong argument for why we need to address it. Now, as I mentioned, this is actually a series of presentations. And the first one, this is a description of what the issue is. The second one is pretty much how we got to where we are. And then if there's interest, a third or more that try to look at practical considerations, discussion of practical considerations about how we proceed so that we just don't get stuck talking about something over and over. One thing about this talk is that there will be, I suspect, some surprising ways in which I talk about the problem. I'm not trying to be controversial. Indeed, I think the problem is so obvious that there's nothing controversial in anything I'm going to say, but it has to do with the scope and the scale, and ultimately in the next presentation, what some of the drivers are in all of this. But the first surprise that I would ask you to do is to think about the issue this way. So imagine you're sitting with a friend. You're watching a football game, and the two of you start reminiscing about the 2024 Super Bowl game between Kansas City and San Francisco, which the two of you watched. And you both watched it. Something comes up in the game, gets you talking about it, and your friend says, you know, most people don't know that the Chiefs didn't win. It was the Niners who won. Everybody thinks the Chiefs won, but no, the Niners actually won. So you kind of give your friend a look askance and basically say, you know, what have you been smoking or what have you been drinking? And he said, are you serious? He said, oh, yeah. Not only that, not only was it that the Niners won, it wasn't the Niners. It was the Philadelphia Eagles who wore the Niners uniforms. They're the ones who beat Kansas City. And he said, in fact, here, and he pulls up his phone and he said, see, that's Jalen Hurts. That's the quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles. That's the guy who was quarterback that day. And now you're really puzzled because you pull up, you know, a picture of Brock Purdy, quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, and you say, everybody knows this guy was the quarterback. And of course, you're well aware of the fact that Brock Purdy is white and Jalen Hurts is black, and so there's no way you can make a mistake about those two. And you say, look, I want to get this right. You're telling me that the San Francisco 49ers were not even in the game, that the Philadelphia Eagles wore their uniforms, Jalen Hurts led them over Patrick Mahomes, and the Chiefs lost. So, oh yeah, absolutely. Most people don't know that, but that's absolutely the deal. Okay, you're more than puzzled, and you just don't know where to go with that, except you have to really worry about if your friend, you know, has 2 feet in reality. Point of that story is that I am arguing that is the situation in which we live in lots of ways without it being recognized as such. That is, there is lots of misinformation out there, lots of falsehoods, everything from the so-called stolen election, you know, which is sort of clearly false, you know, everything from that to the really pernicious lie about immigrants kidnapping pets, to the really almost comical but bizarre idea that Taylor Swift is a psychological operation being run by the Pentagon. There are millions of people who believe this stuff, and it's the equivalent of saying that the Chiefs lost the Super Bowl to the Eagles wearing the 49ers uniforms, and it was really Jalen Hurts who was the quarterback. This should strike you initially as absolutely bizarre. But what I'm going to argue is this is the world in which we live. This is our situation. And it's a situation that we really do have to get serious about correcting. Now, in one way, there's nothing new about this. There's been lots of discussion about disinformation. That's the way we talk about it politely rather than say barefaced lying, but disinformation. And there's an excellent piece, for example, in The Economist about how it works. But that's an article that talks more about sort of the technical way in which it's done. What I want to do is talk about how it works in a different way, how those kinds of falsehoods, the falsehoods equivalent to saying the Niners lost the Eagles as the Niners won the Super Bowl game, that stuff is why it's so prevalent. Okay, so my version of how this works, how disinformation works, has to do with we start talking about the brain. Now, you should be all familiar with that since we all have one. The part of the brain that humans tend to be most proud of, indeed how we even sort of define ourselves as a species, is the prefrontal cortex, because this piece in the front, which is the last part of the brain to mature. Prefrontal cortex is known to be the higher order association center of the brain, as it's responsible for decision-making, reasoning, personality expression, maintaining social appropriateness, and other complex cognitive behaviors. Okay, thinking, complex cognitive behaviors, decision-making, reasoning. That's the part of the brain that does that. That is not the only part of the brain. That is the most recent, and we might think from our perspective, most advanced piece of the brain. But we shouldn't forget that the brain actually, from an evolutionary standpoint, has earlier and then later pieces to it. And one of the earlier parts is what's called the limbic system. This is where emotions come from. So the limbic system, especially the amygdala, the area of the brain which is responsible for emotional processing, especially fear and anxiety. And you've probably heard the phrase amygdala hijack. The reason this is so important is that as I said, from an evolutionary standpoint, this part of the brain is earlier in development than reasoning and thinking. It is programmed to keep us alive, to detect fear, to detect threat, and that's the whole point of fear. It tells us there's a threat, anxiety, that we need to be on guard and take some action to survive. And amygdala hijack is kind of the extreme example of that, where imagine it's a late afternoon, it's dark, you're walking in the woods or somewhere, there's a branch, say, that falls down in front of you. It's not good light. You think maybe it's a snake or something coming at you. Your reaction is you're just going to panic immediately and you're just going to take off. Without even thinking, you will be running to survive. That's the amygdala kicking in. That's the amygdala taking over your muscles and making you move. It's called an amygdala hijack. In that case, that part of the brain trumps the rational part of the brain. Later, you'll calm down, you'll see what it was. But at that moment, your limbic system is in charge because that's what it is hypersensitive to fear and anxiety producing situations. Now, here we have a couple of examples of, this is a front page of a newspaper, front page of the New York Times from maybe about 15 years ago. I just pulled something at random. This is something from a webpage of the London Times about 2-3 weeks ago. Again, it's sort of something I pulled from random. What you should see is a significant difference. This is basically set up that this is all news. Down here is opinion. And that's the way newspapers got set up for a very long time. When you look at this, which is also characteristic of basically any news site you can bring up, so we have a film review, we have a sports scandal in which a referee used a particularly inappropriate insult of a coach. We have a story about a scandal in Church of England, and we have the chief of the RAF suggesting that Ukraine should be able to fire missiles at Russia. okay, this is not happy stuff. This is all kind of edgy stuff. What I'm suggesting is that going from here, about 15 years ago, to here, what's going on is there's a shift of emphasis from appealing to the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. Now, I'm not saying, I want to be clear about this. I'm not saying people sat down and say, how can we get our audience to shift what part of their brain is being fired? But this series of things happened that produced that. And I think that this is really what is going on. That is, there's been a shift in the business model from this to this. The shift has been appealing to information and facts, to appeal for an interest in opinion with hooks and triggers. When I say hooks and triggers, ask yourself the question, how often do you click on a story or an opinion piece because it has you feeling fearful, anxious, threatened, or whatever, as opposed to just intellectually curious? This is now, I think, the main way that most people get pulled in. Particularly, and this becomes particularly significant with disinformation or falsehoods. Now, you're probably thinking, I'm going to trash Fox News, Facebook, and X and say, oh, this is all their fault. Well, first of all, I'm not going to do that. However, they are really the three major players in this. Fox News, if you have not been following this, there is no clearer case of the kind of problems they've had with the truth than their settlement with Dominion cost them almost $750 million over the 2020 election lies. And there was no question about it. The testimony was clear. The texts were clear. As Sean Hannity mentioned, I did not believe it for 1 second that, that Donald Trump had won the election. Elon Musk, once he's taken over X, again, an area where there's just lots of falsehoods, misleading statements, half-truths. That's now a story unto itself. There's no controversy there. Even Facebook has, gotten better than they were in the past, but Mark Zuckerberg stood up at a congressional hearing and apologized to parents. He said, apologize to parents whose kids are harassed and exploited on Facebook. He said, I'm sorry for everything you've gone through, admitted that they really dropped the ball on this. And so, Facebook, Fox, X really have not done what we would like them to have done on this. However, I'm saying that this is an industry problem. I can give you examples from CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Guardian, that are not as egregious. It's not typically a matter of pumping out falsehoods, but certainly shading, tone more than anything else. Fear, anxiety, things that get people, on edge, because as I'm suggesting, that's what keeps us engaged. So this is an industry problem, which basically means the industry is simply responding to what people do. So, but again, I want to stress I'm seeing this as an industry problem and a shift in the industry from perhaps 20 years ago or so more to where it is today. And it's across the board. Difference in degree. What's happened is there has been less of a priority of facts and truth to clicks and engagement, and there is no better way to keep people engaged than keeping them fighting against one another. So we have this idea of we're warring camps, and you have to know, where the threats are coming from. Now, why this is so important as an ethical issue, obviously we have significant issues regarding free expression. Journalists need to put out what they consider to be newsworthy, the public's right to know what's going on. At the same time, though, from an ethical standpoint, we have two clear problems here. We've got the risk of harm, and we've got undermining what should be otherwise free decisions. So we have a sort of really hard-nosed practical issue, and then really a more theoretical one, though, which translates into how people get to choose about their life. Okay, so that's sort of the first look at the problem. And what we need then is a solution. We have disinformation, we have falsehoods, we have misleading statements out there, we have stoking conflict. What we need is a conversation and a consensus. So from a practical standpoint, that's where we need to start. Now, I like to start simple. So it seems to me that the most obvious way we could get consensus is that we say, yeah, we need, whether it comes from in business or outside of business, we need a reasonable limitation on businesses preventing the spread of falsehoods that can kill. So that doesn't seem to me controversial. A reasonable limitation is that businesses shouldn't be spreading falsehoods that can kill. Now, you may say, is it really that serious? So again, let's get really practical. We have examples of falsehoods that have killed. So what I'm trying to do is make this as simple as possible and say, this is not a tough call. And it isn't even, again, something we need to project into the future. We have examples of this. So most recently, in the last few years, the claim that the 2020 election was stolen, the claim that the risks from COVID were exaggerated, the claim that the danger from global warming is exaggerated, those all produced a body count. Now, when I say that they're falsehoods, I'm saying that on all of those, there's a consensus among those with the technical expertise to examine the data objectively and to have no conflict of interest and have engaged in dispassionate study of data. That's the conclusion you come to. Even the idea that you don't necessarily need a consensus on this, but the dispassionate study of data will reveal the same thing. There is such a thing as reality, and this is what we have seen. And in each of those three cases, there is no hard evidence to challenge the objectivity of the situation with all of those. And so we can say, yeah, those three statements were false. Not only that, we can say that the narrative that there was a stolen election left anywhere from 5 to 9 people dead as a result of the January 6th insurrection. Brown School of Public Health released a study that said that of the 1.1 million deaths from COVID, about 300,000 were preventable. And when we talk about climate change, global warming, check out Bloomberg, other sources that pointed to a study that said that every year there are 5 million deaths related to climate change, mainly extreme weather, extreme heat, extreme cold. And again, this should not be any great news to anyone. We've seen storms get more powerful as the oceans get warmer. And so sadly, we have a body count that we can point to as a result of people believing those particular falsehoods. Now, first we look at this and say, okay, this is kind of the combination of a classic yelling fire in the crowded theater that produces people to panic and get hurt. And also people saying there is no fire, it's a hoax, and there's actually fire and people are going to get hurt from that. So from an ethical standpoint, this is not tough. This is a pretty classic kind of problem. So if it's such a clear, serious problem, it shouldn't be difficult to get at least some traction on this. But I think it's fair to say there's absolutely no consensus on how to move on this. There's no consensus. There's been no significant shift that I can see since I've been looking at this really carefully from about 2015 to make any difference. Why is that? Well, the simplest way to put it is I'd say the genie has been let out of the bottle. And it was let out of the bottle when people didn't worry if there was going to be a downside. This is the proverbial problem of opening Pandora's box. And what the genie in the bottle is, so it's not just the matter of yelling fire in a crowded theater or there is no fire. It's the efficacy with which you can do that. It's the size of the megaphone you have, which makes the threat even bigger. So you aren't just yelling fire in the theater, you're yelling fire in the town. It just gets a whole lot worse. The problem is that of the megaphone, the mechanism that lets you spread the lie or the threat or the falsehood more than you could have done before. So how is it the falsehoods that can kill have spread, specifically in the industry I'm talking about? I'd say, it's been an evolution in the industry, in what we used to talk about just as the news industry. First it was just news, and news was serious. News programs were serious. They were down tempo. They were objective. Then we moved into a phase I'd call infotainment. things were lighter. News shows were more peppy and upbeat. They sort of moved into sort of quasi-entertainment. You even had, shows on the Comedy Channel, which were the news, but it was entertainment. Now, what I'd say is we've moved into what I call the info angstotainment part of the business, because the info angstotainment business model is keeping people on edge. It's about anxiety. It's about keeping people worried. It's keeping people threatened, looking over their shoulder. And so what this is it's now monetizing falsehoods, ignorance, fear, and conflict, because you get a big enough megaphone, you get people to click, and that produces profits. I'm saying that deliberately or not, or at least passively, this has now become the primary business model. Now, people in the industry may say, well, that's what we have to do in order to appeal to people. Well, I'm not willing to concede that. And I'm not even discussing that right now. I'm saying, but that is the model. That is the way that people are being appealed to. So let's go back to our friend, the brain, the limbic system. What I'm saying is going on is that this part of the brain is now being appealed to more. That is that in the info angstotainment business model, we get all kinds of hate, fear, conflict, ignorance as the drivers gets triggered through the amygdala, or we get fear, anxiety felt, that causes us to click, and that produces profits. So again, something, as I said before, think of how often you click on a story or an opinion piece because it makes you feel fearful, anxious, or threatened. Well, that's the point of it. That's not accidental. That's the way the limbic system, drives things. So the problem we have then is that what I've been talking about already, you have companies like Fox News, Facebook, X, The Guardian, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, basically anybody connected with information, whether it's news outlets or social media. They're businesses that are running off of this model, and they're basically the megaphones that make this kind of misinformation, disinformation, lies spread. But it's worse than that, because in order to get on the internet, you've got to go through a bunch of other layers of companies involved. Everything from ISP, internet service providers, through cloud services, platforms, and other folk who are making the megaphones and providing the megaphones. If you just talk about cable TV and streaming providers, we've got another more than 500 companies that are doing all of this. Again, this is what makes the megaphones so loud. Now, one thing to keep in mind in this, especially when we try to think about solutions. Businesses are private entities. Businesses are private entities whose primary goal is to make money. Businesses are not public service organizations, and they will continue to prioritize profits. So as much as we want businesses to do good things and not to do stuff that will harm people, it's critical not to say, oh yeah, I can always trust them because they've got my interests. Well, they will tell you, well, they do have your interests at heart, but they have other people's interests first, shareholders, or themselves. But this simply means, in looking for solutions, you have to keep in mind the reality of the fact that this is what is driving the current situation. Now, that means we either need some kind of self-regulation or consumer action or government action in order to address this. And this is something we'll talk about down the road when we talk about possible solutions. But one of the other things that concerns me about this is that what I do not see in the conversation is this is a consumer safety issue. We as consumers, when we use any of those outlets, are consuming information. It is the misinformation harms people just as much as a defective toaster harms someone. Does it in a different way, but it's harmed just as much. And I think that one of the things we need to do is to start talking about this as a consumer safety issue, not just a matter of, oh, gee, this is misinformation, disinformation. But the other thing that I want to underscore on this, in a way, this is sort of another sort of surprising thing I'm going to suggest, is that ultimately it does come down to personal responsibility to do research on critical issues. If you've got a critical issue that you're going to make a decision on, you need to know what the facts are. You need to know what the facts are, not just trust that someone whom you like is telling, or your friends and neighbors tell that. That cannot be the touchstone for having enough information to make a decision. Now, the hard thing about that concept is I'm going to tell you a little story about what, in my opinion, it means taking personal responsibility to be, as it were, in the game, to be in a position to discuss seriously issues like this. So about 10 or 15 years ago, a friend of mine who's a prominent oceanographer asked if I would partner with him on doing a book on ethical issues related to global warming. We basically wrote a draft. Other things got in the way. We never got to publish it, but I learned an enormous amount because I had not known anything about planetary science. I knew a fair amount about marine mammal science. And so what I discovered was, in order to have an intelligent discussion about global warming and global climate change, you had to really dig in, and you had to know everything from the basic science. You had to know about the CO2 and other gases, probably more that are more lethal than CO2 in the atmosphere. You need to know about the work of the IPCC, the UN body that for 35 years or more has been putting out reports on this. One of my favorite things is you need to know about the ice core data. There's ice core data that goes back like 800,000 years, which tracks what's been in the atmosphere. If you don't know about that stuff, if this is a puzzle to you, go find about it. You also need to have read 2 reports that have been put out on national security and climate change, which are put out by former military folk. You need to know about where the US stands in relation to what we produce and how we stand with other countries. And you also need to be sort of involved in the discussion about nuclear power, because nuclear is now so often referred to as one of the ways in which we can sort of address climate change. And as with any of this thing, so as part of what I'm saying is you really have to get into the data on this. You have to get into the details, and if you don't, you're really just you shouldn't be in the game. I mean, it's not that your opinion doesn't count, but take responsibility for the fact that you don't have an informed opinion. And nuclear, for example, even if it's seen as an important solution, even some of the most sort of pro-nuclear scientists will point out, they'll say, look, there's a lot of controversy, and even only a small amount of nuclear waste, approximately 3% of the total, is long-lived and highly radioactive and requires isolation from the environment for many thousands of years. So the good news in a report that they've issued that I've read is that this is the good news. Only a small volume is highly radioactive and requires isolation for many thousands of years. Okay, many thousands of years makes me nervous. And I then have a hard time thinking, when in human history has there ever been enough stability that we could say, yeah, we can trust that something that's lethal will be on ice for many thousands of years. But my point in this is personal responsibility on critical issues about which you're going to make a decision means you have to do the homework. It means you can't just trust people whom you like, whom you've gotten used to listening to. You have to learn the science. In this case, this is one of those situations. With the stolen election thing, you have to read the law. There were more than 60 cases, state and federal cases on that. You have to read. If you have any doubt about it, if you have any doubt about what's going on, you have to read. You have to get to the data. Now, when I said before, it's talking about how the spread of disinformation works, and that it works by triggering the limbic system. Okay, there's another piece of this that I want to point out to you, and that's what I call Potemkin terrorism. So you probably all know about the story of the Potemkin village storefronts, as it were, that were imaginary buildings that didn't really exist. So Potemkin village ideas, you've got villages that look like they're there, but they really aren't. Now, Potemkin terrorism is when you take normal people and you now create imaginary enemies. So you take normal folk, good and decent people, and you somehow turn them into monsters, people who are threats. And that's something that is another piece of how disinformation spreads. It's something we're going to get into more in the next talk, but this is a particularly pernicious way to do things because it's a mechanism by which you take good people and make everybody think they're bad. So this is where we are. You know, the broad situation is this is where we are. We have serious harm and we have preventable deaths that's driven by a business model. I'm not saying it's intentional, but it's driven by a business model that is highly profitable and it has a body count connected with it. Now, I want to shift gears and give you at least a brief theoretical piece to the talk, because as I said before, there are really two ways in which this is a significant ethical issue. One is which it produces really serious harm, tangible harm, people being hurt, people being killed. Now, the other piece of this is the way in which the monetization of falsehoods and fear and the like is ethically problematic because it undermines decisions that should otherwise be free. And one of the reasons that freedom is such a big deal is that particularly if you're a hardline capitalist, you like the idea that, oh yeah, it's all about freedom. And you probably worship the altar of Milton Friedman, who in a very famous essay says that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And the only things you've got to worry about, you have to conform to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Now, to abide by the rules of the society embodied in ethical custom is regularly ignored as one of the things that Friedman said. And that's so critical here because truth is absolutely central to the ethical customs and fundamental values on which the society, even the economy, is built. Why is it so important? Because if you're big about freedom, truth is a necessary condition for a genuinely free decision. We have to have free consent in an agreement. We have to have the absence of coercion and deception and manipulation. People have to be fully informed. In fact, the reason that fraud is a big deal from a legal standpoint is because fraud is fundamentally compromising the truth. If you've been defrauded, you've probably either been coerced or manipulated, you weren't told the truth, you were lied to. Any of those, that's what we're talking about. And so, yeah, we even have statutes of this, and it's taken seriously. It's taken seriously because it undermines one of the basic principles on which not only the economy, but our whole society is based on. And it seems to me, if we're going to talk about the truth, that when we talk about looking for solutions in the future, there's nothing simpler than what people swear into in court, that they should tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, that's not what goes on when people are doing newscasts. Nobody says, we're going to give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Any outlet where we see things being compromised and they say, well, it's opinion or it's entertainment, that's not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But I think that as a culture, we should be able to insist on that. We should be able to insist on knowing what the deal is, all of the deal, so that we can make informed judgments. Otherwise, it's not a free decision. And one of the important things to think about, to remember, is the reason that someone lies to us is to get us to do something that they have good reason to think we would not do if we knew all the facts. And so if you are truly a proponent of freedom and respect other people and not that you aren't one of these people who likes to tell other people what to do, that means you really owe them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And any compromise on that is really serious. Now, one other theoretical point on this that you might keep in mind, I'm sort of working a bit here with an idea that comes out of John Rawls' work on the theory of justice. Rawls is what's called a social contract theorist. His approach is that everything that would justify restrictions in a society, the rules of a society, the best way to get those so that they're philosophically and ethically legitimate is it's a matter of consent. It's what people would agree to. Indeed, everything going back to the Constitution, the Mayflower Compact, anything, any document with with rules and limitations, the Magna Carta, the idea it's a contract. There's an agreement here. And so the way that we can bring this in is to say, okay, let's ask if we were to draw up a contract and if we were to draw up terms by which business may or may not, sort of can may or may not operate, what would we say of this? Let's say we have a contract and in it we find the term, businesses may profit from spreading claims they know to be false, which can reasonably be expected to lead to people being hurt, possibly even dying. Would any one of us sign that? Freely sign the idea that, yeah, businesses may profit from spreading claims they know to be false, which can reasonably be expected to lead to people being hurt, possibly even dying? No. And there's nothing controversial about this. This is obvious. No one in his or her right mind would agree to that. Okay, so now we're back to where we started. What I'm arguing is that the situation in which we find ourselves is the equivalent of your friend believing that the Eagles won the Super Bowl wearing the 49ers uniforms, and it was Jalen Hurts and it was not Brock Purdy who was the quarterback on the winning team. Our situation is that 35% of Americans still think that the 2020 election was uncertain at best or was stolen. Nearly half of Republicans believe that pernicious story about immigrants kidnapping people's pets, and 20% of Americans seem to agree with the really bizarre idea that Taylor Swift is a psychological operation being run by the Pentagon. In short, millions of us make important decisions based on falsehoods that we've been exposed to by businesses, decisions that have the likelihood of harming innocent people. That's the situation we're in. We've got tons of falsehoods, and I haven't even scratched the surface about all the stuff that's out there. You know all the stuff that's out there that's just runs from false to ridiculous. But the thing is that millions of people make decisions based on falsehoods and that they've been exposed to them by businesses. That's why this is such an important business ethics issue. They aren't just being told them by neighbors or picking them up, on their own research of primary data. They're getting these falsehoods from businesses. But the worst thing is, this is a business model that I believe no ethical business owner, executive, or employee would ever choose. We're in a situation that no one would have ever wanted to get. And this is, the genie got let out of the bottle. The, business sort of, the pursuit of profit kind of took over, and everyone's thinking, yeah, we'll manage this along the way, but we didn't. And so problem is not just millions of people are making decisions based on falsehoods that they've gotten from through a variety of businesses, but this is a business model that no ordinary business owner, executive, or employee would ever choose to be there have as business in the first place. So here's the real question. Why is it harder to get people to doubt the winner of the Super Bowl than the outcome of the 2020 election? the life-threatening risks of COVID and the multiple long-term planetary threats of global climate change. That's the situation we're facing. You would have a really hard time selling the idea that the Kansas City Chiefs lost the 2024 Super Bowl. You'd have an easier time getting people to doubt any of these things. That is not only serious, that's really scary. But that's the question. Why is it that we're better on football than we are on all these other things? And with all respect to football fans, of which I am one, this stuff is more serious. Okay, now here's the really surprising thing that I'm going to suggest. That's not the problem. That's a symptom of the problem. Everything I've talked about is serious. It's bad. It needs a solution. But that's not the problem. That's a problem. There's a more fundamental problem of which this is a symptom. And so the answer to the problem is what makes this situation possible in the first place. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next presentation, which will be in January. But since I don't believe in leaving people hanging, I'm at least going to give you a hint as to what the answer is. So think about that. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope this has been interesting, educational, engaging, all of the above. If you are watching this on or around Giving Tuesday, I would encourage you to consider making a donation when you get through with this to the International Business Ethics Case Competition. I would also like to encourage you to distribute the link of this talk to spread it to anyone you think might be interested. As I said, my goal in this is to encourage discussion. It is not to assign blame. It is to educate people about what the problem is. It's to appreciate, A, how serious it is, and B, to appreciate the fact that we all know how serious it is and that we haven't gotten any movement on this at all ever since it became clear that we have a body count connected with this problem. So I would certainly encourage people to distribute the link, people you think might be interested. Now, on the Socrates Comes to Wall Street website, you will see there's a page there where you're able to post comments. It's set up the way it is, which means the comments have to be moderated. That is, I have to see them first before they get posted. But that's because if you don't do that, we're going to get spammed like crazy. So that's not to limit the discussion, just means that it needs to be managed. And also, you will find at least reference to most of the sources that I used on this. And for any other questions, you're free to write to me at thomas.white@ibecc.net. And thank you again, and I hope to see you again next month.